She'd been sitting there for 2 hours. Nobody noticed what she was doing. She waited until the auctioneer called the third parcel of water rights. Then she raised her hand. A man in the front row laughed. He was a rancher with a red face and a thick neck. He laughed loud. She didn't flinch. She just looked at him, and then she raised her hand again. She sat in the back row of the county auction hall, a small notebook open on her knee, and watched the men in cowboy hats buy water. The hall was a rectangle of beige walls and fluorescent lights, the kind of room that had been built for 4-H meetings and tax appeals. 50 metal folding chairs in neat rows, an easel with a laminated map of the valley, a wooden podium with a microphone that hummed when no one spoke. The air smelled of old coffee and damp denim, and the particular sourness of men who had been waiting too long. They came from every ranch in the county. Men with sun-cracked hands and belt buckles shaped like bulls, men who had inherited their land and their grudges in equal measure. They sat in the front rows, leaning forward, elbows on knees, watching the auctioneer the way a congregation watches a preacher. The auctioneer was a stout man in a dark brown cowboy hat, his silver-gray hair combed back beneath it, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with practiced efficiency. He carried a wooden gavel in his right hand and a stack of papers in his left. His posture was confident, leaning slightly forward with a wide stance, as if the podium were a horse he had ridden 1,000 times. He called the first parcel, a quarter section of dry creek bed north of the highway, water rights that had not been touched in 20 years. The ranchers in the front row bid quickly, efficiently, without ceremony. The gavel fell. The parcel was gone. The girl in the back row did not move. She had been sitting there for 2 hours. Nobody noticed what she was doing. Her name was not important yet. What mattered was what she carried. A brass key on a length of twine, tucked inside her olive-green canvas jacket. A small notebook with a list of parcel numbers written in careful block letters. And a bank envelope, folded twice, pressed flat against her chest. She had worn her best clothes for the auction. Her boots were scuffed and too large, hand-me-downs from a cousin who had grown faster than she had. The tear at her left knee was not fashion. It was wear. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, a few loose strands framing her face. A small silver stud glinted in her left ear. She looked like she had come straight from school or from a job she was too young to hold. But her hands were steady in her lap. The first 3 parcels sold without her. She did not bid. She did not fidget. She simply watched, her gray-blue eyes moving from the auctioneer to the map, to the faces of the men who were buying what her grandfather had once called the valley's last breath. The 4th parcel was different. The auctioneer cleared his throat and pointed to a narrow strip of land on the map, drawn in blue ink along a dry creek bed. "Parcel 4, he said. "Water access on the South Fork. Minimum bid, $2,000. Silence. The ranchers shifted in their chairs. A man in the front row, red-faced and thick-necked, wearing a dusty denim jacket, muttered something to the man beside him. The other man shook his head. No one bid. The auctioneer waited. He looked at his list. He looked at the room. 2,000, he repeated. Going once. The girl raised her hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. Her hand rose slowly, palm open, as if she were asking a question in a classroom. Her face did not change. She simply held her hand in the air and waited. The auctioneer paused. He squinted at her, trying to place her face. He did not recognize her. She was not on the list of registered bidders he had memorized. She was not a rancher. She was not a farmer. She was a girl in a canvas jacket with a brass key around her neck. "You registered, miss?" he asked. She nodded once. The red-faced rancher in the front row turned to look at her. His mouth opened. A sound came out that was half cough, half laugh. "She bid?" he said, loud enough for the room to hear. "On water?" The girl did not look at him. She kept her hand raised, her eyes fixed on the auctioneer. The auctioneer's gavel hovered in the air, a breath away from its fall. 2,000, he said. "Going twice." The red-faced rancher laughed again. It was a loud laugh, the kind of laugh that was meant to fill a room and push someone out of it. His shoulders shook. The men around him glanced at each other, uncertain whether to join in. The girl did not flinch. She simply looked at him, and then she raised her hand again. The laughter stopped. The auctioneer brought the gavel down. The sound was sharp, final, like a door closing. "Sold to the young lady," he said. "Parcel 4. The red-faced rancher stared at her. His smile had not disappeared so much as frozen, a thing of plastic that no longer fit his face. He turned back to the front, his neck thick and red, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The girl wrote something in her notebook, a single line. The parcel number, the amount, the time. The 5th parcel was called. A narrow strip along the river, where the water ran clear even in the dry months. The red-faced rancher bid first. His voice was rough, impatient. 3,000. The girl raised her hand. 3,500, the auctioneer said. The rancher turned his head, just enough to show the side of his face. He did not look at her. 4. 4,500, the girl said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. The room had gone still. The fluorescent lights hummed. The men in the front rows were no longer leaning forward. They were sitting up straight, watching the back of the room. The rancher hesitated. He looked at his hands. He looked at the map. He looked at the girl. 5, he said. 5,500, she said. He stopped. The auctioneer waited. The gavel was in the air again. The room held its breath. The rancher said nothing. "Going once," the auctioneer said. "Going twice." The gavel fell. "Sold." The girl wrote another line in her notebook. The auctioneer looked at his list. He had a stack of papers in his left hand, and he flipped through them slowly, his pale blue eyes moving down the page. He saw that she had been registered for every parcel since 8 a.m. that morning. Every single one. She had signed her name on every form. She had paid the registration fee in cash. He looked up at her. She met his gaze. Her face was still, her hands resting on the notebook. He called the 6th parcel. By the 5th parcel, she had won 4. The red-faced rancher in the front row had stopped laughing. By the 6th, the room had changed. The men in the front rows were no longer watching the auctioneer. They were watching her. They turned in their chairs, their elbows on the backs, their eyes following her hand every time it rose. A few of them had taken out their phones. A few had pulled out their own notebooks, writing down parcel numbers, trying to understand what she was doing. She did not look at them. She looked at the map. She looked at the auctioneer. She raised her hand when the parcel was right. She lowered it when it was not. She did not explain herself. She did not need to. The auctioneer's voice had changed too. It had lost its practiced rhythm, the sing-song cadence of a man who had called 1,000 auctions. He was reading the parcels now, not performing them. He was checking his list more often. He was looking at the girl between each sale. By the 7th parcel, the red-faced rancher stopped bidding altogether. He sat in his chair, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. He did not look at the girl. He looked at the floor. The girl won the 7th parcel. She wrote it down. The auctioneer called the next one. She raised her hand. The room was silent. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the scratch of her pen on paper. She had spent every dollar her grandfather had left her. She had won 7 parcels, but she still needed one more. The brass key swung against her chest, hidden beneath the canvas jacket, warm from her skin. She did not touch it. She did not need to. She knew what it opened. By the 5th parcel, she had won 4. The rancher in the front row stopped laughing. The room had changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by something quieter, something that sat in the space between breaths. The men in the metal chairs no longer turned to look at her with amusement. They turned to look at her with curiosity, and behind that, a thin edge of unease. The auctioneer adjusted his cowboy hat. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. The sweat stains under his arms had spread, darkening the beige fabric. He looked at his list again, then at the girl in the back row. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded in her lap. The small notebook was open, the list of parcel numbers visible only to her. He called the next parcel. Number 6. A quarter-mile stretch of irrigation ditch that had been dry for 30 years. The starting bid was $2,000. No one spoke. The auctioneer waited. He looked at the ranchers in the front rows, the men who had bid on everything else. They stared at their boots, at the floor, at the clock on the wall. No one wanted a dry ditch. No one knew what to do with a piece of nothing. The girl raised her hand. The auctioneer nodded. He didn't pause this time. He didn't ask if she was serious. He just called the bid, once, twice, 3 times. The gavel came down, sold. She wrote something in her notebook. The brass key at her neck caught the fluorescent light for a moment. A small flash of gold against the white cotton of her shirt. The auctioneer called Parcel 7. A sliver of land along the riverbank, barely wide enough for a truck to drive across. It had been used as an access road for decades, but no one held the deed. The county had taken it for unpaid taxes in 1982, and no one had ever bought it back. The starting bid was $500. A man in the 3rd row raised his hand. He was a farmer with a thin face and a plaid shirt. He wanted the access road. It led to his back pasture. The girl raised her hand. The farmer looked at her. He raised his bid to $700. She raised to $8. He went to $9. She went to $1,000. He stopped. He shook his head. He turned back around in his chair. The auctioneer looked at her. She met his eyes. There was no expression on her face. No triumph, no relief. Just the same calm, gray-blue gaze she had worn since she walked through the door at 8 that morning. The gavel came down. Sold. She wrote in her notebook. The page was filling up. 7 parcels now, all of them water rights, all of them dry and forgotten, all of them hers. The auctioneer set down his gavel. He picked up a stack of papers and shuffled through them. He looked at the girl again, then at the county clerk sitting at a small table near the front. He said something to the clerk. The clerk nodded. The auctioneer turned back to the room. "The next parcel is the main water easement," he said. "It connects all the smaller parcels along the north side of the valley. The starting bid is $10,000. The room stirred. $10,000 was real money. It was the kind of money that bought a new tractor, or paid off a loan, or sent a kid to college. It was the kind of money that made men stop and think. A man in a dark suit stood up from the back of the room. He was not a rancher. He was a lawyer from the county water board. He had been sitting in the corner, watching, waiting. "That parcel is not for sale," he said. "It's held in trust by the county." The auctioneer looked at him. The room went quiet. The girl opened her notebook. She turned to a page she had marked with a folded corner. She read aloud, her voice soft but clear. Section 47-12 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. 1978 revision, she said. Any easement held in trust for more than 30 years without active use may be sold at public auction upon petition of the county board. The lawyer stared at her. He asked to see her source. She stood up, walked to the front of the room, and handed him a photocopied page from a law book. The page was yellowed, creased at the edges, worn from being folded and unfolded many times. The lawyer read it. His face changed. The color drained from his cheeks. He looked at the girl, then at the auctioneer, then back at the page. He handed it back to her without a word. The auctioneer called the county clerk over. They spoke in low voices. The clerk nodded, pulled a thick binder from under the table, and flipped through it. He found a page, read it, and nodded again. "The statute is valid," he said. "The easement goes to auction." The lawyer sat down. He did not look at the girl again. The auctioneer called for bids. 3 men raised their hands. A rancher from the east side of the valley, a developer from the city, and the thin-faced farmer who had wanted the access road. The bidding started at 10,000. It climbed quickly. 11, 12, 13. The rancher dropped out at 14. The developer went to 15. The farmer went to 16. The girl waited. She watched the bidding climb. She watched the faces of the men who were spending money they had earned with their hands, money that represented years of work, years of hope. She did not flinch. When the developer bid 18,000, the farmer shook his head. He was done. The developer looked around the room. He thought he had won. The girl raised her hand. 19,000, she said. The room went silent. The developer turned to look at her. He was a man in his 50s, with a gold watch and a clean shave. He did not know who she was. He did not know where she had come from. He bid 20,000. She bid 21. He bid 22. She bid 23. He stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. The auctioneer called the bid once, twice, 3 times. The gavel came down. Sold. The girl sat back in her chair. She closed her notebook. She had spent every dollar her grandfather had left her. She had won 7 parcels. But she still needed 1 more. The brass key hung against her chest, warm from her skin. She touched it with her fingertips, a small, unconscious gesture. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited for the next parcel to be called. She had spent every dollar her grandfather had left her. She had won 7 parcels, but she still needed 1 more. The auctioneer called for a short recess. The men in the hall stood, stretching, rubbing their eyes, moving toward the water cooler in small clusters. The girl remained seated. She opened her notebook and read her list again. 7 parcels, all water access, all connected by a single thread she had traced through county records for 3 weeks. She had bought the threads, but she had not bought the weave. The rancher from the front row walked past her. He did not look at her. He was already on his phone, his voice low and sharp, the words half muffled by his hand. She heard only the tone. It was the sound of a man who had lost something he had assumed was his. The auctioneer returned to the podium. He tapped the microphone with 2 fingers. The hall settled. He held up a single sheet of paper. Parcel 12. The main spring. 20 acres of land holding the source of the water that fed every creek and every easement she had just bought. The starting bid was announced. The rancher from the front row stood up before the auctioneer finished speaking. He said he would pay double the starting bid. His voice was flat, final. He turned his head and looked directly at the girl. She did not meet his eyes. She looked at the map on the easel. She looked at the spring marked in blue ink, a small circle at the center of a green square. The auctioneer called for bids. The rancher raised his hand. A farmer in the third row raised his hand. The rancher raised again. The farmer dropped. The rancher looked at the girl. She did not raise her hand. The auctioneer called the bid once, twice, 3 times. Sold to the rancher. The room exhaled. The rancher sat down. He looked at the girl with something between relief and confusion. She had stopped bidding. She had let him win. He did not understand why. She knew. The spring sat on his land. He owned the dirt. But the water that came out of that spring flowed through 7 creeks, and every one of those creeks crossed a parcel she now controlled. He could stand at the source. He could touch the water, but he could not move it. He could not sell it. He could not use it, not without her permission. The rancher figured it out mid-handshake. He was shaking the auctioneer's hand, smiling, his other hand already reaching for the deed. Then he stopped. His hand froze. His smile did not fall so much as it hardened into something else. He turned his head slowly. He looked at the girl. She met his eyes for the first time that day. The room went quiet. The other men felt it before they understood it. They shifted in their chairs. They looked at the rancher. They looked at the girl. They looked at the map on the easel, at the blue lines crossing the green squares. And slowly, one by one, they began to see what the girl had seen 3 months ago. She had not bought the land. She had bought the water. And in that valley, in that dry country where every creek was measured in inches and every well was a gamble, the water was the only thing that mattered. The rancher said something. His voice was low, but the room was silent enough that everyone heard it. He said, "You knew." She did not answer. She did not need to. Her notebook lay open in her lap, the 7 parcel numbers listed in her grandfather's handwriting, the ink faded but still legible. She had copied them from a stack of deeds he had kept in a shoebox under his bed. He had told her, "The water is still there. It just needs someone to go get it." She had gone. She had gotten it. The rancher stood at the podium, his hand still resting on the deed he had just signed. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the map. The spring was his. The water was not. He could not pump it. He could not pipe it. He could not sell a single gallon. The easements she held covered every path the water could take to reach anyone else's land. He owned the source. She owned the flow. He asked her what she wanted. She told him. Her voice was quiet. She said she would lease him access to the water. She said the price would be fair. She said it would be enough to pay back every dollar her grandfather had left her. She said he could keep the spring. She did not want the land. She only wanted the water to move again, the way it had moved before the county sold the rights and let the creeks go dry. The rancher stared at her. He was a man who had spent 40 years in this valley, fighting for every inch of ground, every drop of rain. He had lost a drought. He had lost a lawsuit. He had lost 2 sons to the city. He had never lost to a 17-year-old girl with a notebook and a brass key around her neck. But he had lost today. He said he would think about it. She said he had until noon tomorrow. She had already drafted the lease. She pulled a folded paper from her notebook and laid it on the podium. The terms were simple. The price was exact. She had calculated it to the penny. The rancher looked at the paper. He did not pick it up. He did not speak. The girl stood. She closed her notebook. She tucked it under her arm. She walked down the aisle between the rows of metal chairs, past the men in cowboy hats and denim, past the lawyer from the county water board, past the farmer who had laughed at her 4 hours ago. He did not laugh now. None of them laughed. She reached the door. She paused. She turned her head, just slightly, and looked back at the rancher. He was still standing at the podium, the folded lease in his hand, his face pale under the fluorescent light. She walked out of the hall with her notebook and the brass key. Behind her, the rancher stood alone. She looked at the map one last time. She had bought the water, but she had not bought the land. The auctioneer cleared his throat and called the final parcel. 20 acres, the main spring, the source of every creek and every well in the valley. The rancher from the front row stood up before the auctioneer finished speaking. He said he would pay double the starting bid. He said it loud enough for the whole room to hear. The girl did not move. She kept her hands folded in her lap. The brass key hung against her chest, hidden beneath the cotton of her shirt. She watched the rancher the way she had watched everything that morning, with the patience of someone who had already seen the end of the story. The auctioneer looked at her. Everyone looked at her. She did not raise her hand. The rancher laughed, not the loud laugh from before. This was a different laugh, a relieved laugh. He thought she had run out of money. He thought she had run out of nerve. He was wrong. The auctioneer called for bids. The rancher bid. A farmer in the third row bid. The rancher raised. The farmer dropped. The auctioneer called it once. The girl did not move. Twice. She did not move. 3 times. Sold to the rancher. The room exhaled. Men clapped the rancher on the back. He turned to shake hands with the auctioneer, his face flushed with victory. He was already planning what he would do with the water. He was already counting the money it would bring. The girl stood up. She did it slowly. She folded her notebook and tucked it under her arm. She walked down the aisle between the metal chairs. Her work boots were too large for her feet, but she walked with the same deliberate certainty her grandfather had shown when he checked his fence lines before a storm. She stopped at the front of the room. The rancher was still shaking hands. He saw her and his smile faltered. She waited. The room went quiet. She said, "You own the spring?" The rancher nodded. He puffed his chest out a little. "I do." She said, "But I own the water." She said it flat, not a threat, not a negotiation, a statement of fact, the way a surveyor reads a boundary line. The rancher's hand stopped midair. He turned to face her fully. "What are you talking about?" She opened her notebook and read the parcel numbers. 7 of them. 7 easements. 7 rights to cross 7 different properties and draw 7 different flows. The spring sat on the rancher's land, but every path the water could take to reach the valley passed through ground she now controlled. The rancher stared at her. He did not laugh this time. He said, "That's not how it works." The girl looked at the county clerk, a thin man in a short-sleeved shirt who had been sitting at a table near the podium. She said, "Can you explain it to him?" The clerk stood up. He had the tired, patient voice of a man who had explained the same law to 100 different people and watched them fail to understand. He said, "The spring is his. The water is hers. She holds the easements. He cannot access the spring without crossing her parcels. He cannot draw the water without her permission. The statute is clear." The rancher's face went pale. It was the kind of pale that came from the inside. The blood drained out, and then something else moved in to take its place. He said, "I'll sue." The clerk shook his head. "You have no standing. The statute was written in 1978. It's been on the books for 40 years. She read it. You didn't." The rancher turned to the girl. His voice was lower now. He said, "What do you want?" She told him. She would lease him access, a fair price, enough to pay back the money her grandfather had left her. Not a penny more. She said, "You can use the water. You just can't own it. It belongs to the valley. It always did." The rancher looked at the other farmers in the room. They were watching him. They had watched him laugh at the girl that morning. They had watched him bid against her. They were watching him now to see what he would do. He said, "How long?" She said, 20 years. After that, we renegotiate." He said, "That's not fair." She said, "It's fairer than what you were going to do." He had no answer to that. He looked at the floor. He looked at his boots. He looked at the map on the easel, the spring marked with a blue circle, the parcels she owned traced in the careful lines of her grandfather's hand. He agreed. She did not smile. She folded the lease and put it in her notebook. She tucked the notebook under her arm. She turned and walked toward the door. The afternoon sun was low through the dusty windows. It fell across the floor in long yellow rectangles. She walked through them, one after another, her shadow stretching out ahead of her. The brass key swung against her chest. It had been her grandfather's key. He had worn it on a leather cord for 40 years. When he died, she had taken it off his neck and put it on her own. He had never told her what it opened. She had never asked. Some things are not meant to be opened. Some things are meant to be carried. She reached the door. She pushed it open. The air outside was dry and cool, the smell of sage and dust in the coming evening. She stepped through. Behind her, the rancher stood alone in the middle of the room. The other men were gathering their papers and their hats. They did not look at him. They did not know what to say. He had come to the auction to buy the valley. He had bought the spring. But the girl had bought the water. And without the water, the spring was just a hole in the ground. She walked across the gravel lot to her grandfather's truck. It was an old Ford, pale blue, the paint faded to a dusty gray. The passenger seat was piled with maps and deeds and photocopied pages from law books. She climbed in and sat for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel, her eyes on the auction hall in the rearview mirror. She had spent every dollar her grandfather had left her. She had won 7 parcels. She had stopped the rancher from taking what did not belong to him. But she had not bought the land. The land still belonged to the county. The spring still sat on a 20-acre plot that would be sold again, someday, to someone else. She had bought the water, but she had not bought the ground it ran through. She looked at the map one last time. She had bought the water, but she had not bought the land. The rancher looked at her. His hand was still in the air, halfway to the auctioneers. He had won the land, but the room was already shifting. The other farmers were watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. The girl did not move. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the notebook closed, the brass key resting against her chest beneath the olive-green canvas jacket. Her gray-blue eyes were steady, fixed on a point somewhere past the rancher's shoulder, as if she were reading something written on the far wall. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Sold to Mr. Henderson," he said, but the words had no weight. They were a formality now, a sound made to fill silence. The rancher, Henderson, turned to face her. His red face had deepened to a mottled purple. He took 2 steps toward her row, his boots heavy on the linoleum. "You," he said. "What did you just do?" She looked up at him. Her voice was quiet, almost soft. "I bought the water rights that cross your property. 7 parcels, every easement that touches that spring." Henderson's jaw worked. He looked at the auctioneer, then at the county clerk, then back at her. "That's not possible. The spring is on my land. I just bought it." The spring is on your land, she said, but the water belongs to whoever holds the easement. That's me. She spoke the words the way her grandfather had taught her, without triumph, without anger, just a fact laid flat on the table like a deed. The county clerk stepped forward. He was a thin man in a short-sleeved shirt, his glasses perched low on his nose. He held a thick binder open in his hands. She's correct, he said. The water rights were severed from the land in 1983. They've been held in trust by the county ever since. The statute allows private purchase of unused easements. She filed the paperwork this morning. Henderson stared at him. This morning? Before the auction opened, the clerk said. She was the first to register. The room was silent. The other farmers had stopped pretending to look at their pamphlets. They were watching Henderson, watching the girl, watching the clerk. No one spoke. Henderson took a step closer to her. His voice was lower now, almost pleading. You can't do this. I need that water. My herd. I've got 300 head that depend on that spring. She looked at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she reached into her notebook and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She held it out to him. He took it. His eyes scanned the text. His face changed. It's a lease, she said. 1 year, renewable. You pay me what the county would have charged you for the water, plus a small fee to cover my grandfather's savings. That's it. Henderson read the paper again. He looked at her. Why? She did not answer immediately. She stood up from the metal chair, her scuffed boots finding the floor. She was smaller than him, her shoulder barely reaching his chest. But she did not step back. Because the water belongs here, she said. It belongs to the valley. Not to me, not to you. It belongs to the people who work this land. I'm not here to take it away. I'm here to make sure it's used right. Henderson looked at the paper in his hands. His thumb traced the edge of it. Your grandfather, he said. Frank Vance. She nodded. I knew Frank, Henderson said. He was a good man, stubborn, but good. She did not reply. She waited. Henderson looked at the other farmers. They were watching him, their faces unreadable. He looked back at the girl. Then he pulled a pen from his shirt pocket and signed the lease. He handed it back to her. 1 year, he said. We'll talk again next spring. She folded the paper and placed it in her notebook. She did not smile. She did not offer her hand. She simply nodded once, the way her grandfather used to when a deal was done. She turned and walked toward the door. The brass key swung at her neck, catching the light from the dusty windows. The room parted for her, the farmers stepping aside without a word. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the afternoon sun. The air was dry and warm, carrying the smell of dust and sage. The parking lot was gravel and cracked asphalt. A single pickup truck sat under a bare tree. She walked to the truck and climbed in. The seat was worn, the vinyl cracked. She placed the notebook on the passenger seat and started the engine. Behind her, in the auction hall, Henderson stood alone. The other farmers had already begun to leave, their conversations low and private. The auctioneer was packing his papers. The county clerk was closing his binder. Henderson did not move. He stood in the middle of the room, still holding the lease he had signed, staring at the door she had walked through. The girl drove down the gravel road, past the dry fields and the empty irrigation ditches. She drove past the old Vance place, where her grandfather had lived for 60 years, where the barn still stood with its sagging roof and the fence posts leaned at odd angles. She did not stop. She drove until the road turned to dirt, then to a track, then to nothing. She parked at the edge of a dry creek bed. where the cottonwoods grew thick and the ground was soft. She got out of the truck and walked to the creek. The water was low, barely a trickle. But it was there. It had always been there, waiting. She knelt down and touched the water with her fingers. It was cold, colder than the air. She let it run through her hand. She thought of her grandfather, sitting at the kitchen table, his gnarled hands spread across the map. She thought of the stack of deeds in the bank envelope, the cash he had saved for years, the note he had left her. She thought of the auction hall, the laughter, the silence, the signed lease. She stood up and walked back to the truck. She took the brass key from around her neck and held it in her palm. It was warm from her skin. She did not know what came next. The water was hers, but the work was only beginning. There were fences to mend, ditches to dig, neighbors to talk to. There was a valley to bring back to life. She climbed into the truck and started the engine. She looked out at the dry land, the empty fields, the distant mountains. She put the key in the ignition and drove forward. The road was long, but she had time, and she had the water.